Our state senators and House representatives have wrapped up the 2017 legislative session. How'd they do? This week on Insights, two leaders from the House and Senate will sit down with two reporters who followed all the hearings and testimony closely. Each will grade this session on progress made with key issues and important legislation passed. See if you agree. The grades are in. This live broadcast and live stream of Insights on PBS Hawai'i start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff with Hawaii News Now. The 2017 legislative session adjourned last week without an agreement on how to fund cost increases for the 20-mile rail project. Nevertheless, some significant measures are moving onto the governor's desk, while other closely watched bills lost traction and died. Join us tonight as we examine some of the key areas of legislation that were under consideration during this past session. We have two political observers with us and two legislative leaders to evaluate how lawmakers fared this year. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, or tweet your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and our Facebook page. Now to our guest. Ron Kochi has served as the president of the state senate since 2015. He represents Kauai and Niihau. President Kochi previously served as majority caucus leader, vice chair for the committees on tourism and on ways and means. Scott Saiki is the newly elected Speaker of the State House. He serves as the representative for the areas including Macaulay, Kaheka, Kaka'ako, and downtown Honolulu. In addition to being a state representative, Speaker Saiki currently practices law. Civil Beat reporter Chad Blair has been a writer, editor, and teacher in Honolulu for more than 20 years. His reporting covers how political decisions impact people and communities throughout Hawaii. And Wayne Yoshioka is the political reporter for Hawaii Public Radio. He started his journalism career in television news, covering Honolulu city and county government. He went on to serve as spokesperson for the State Department of Defense and Civil Defense. He served at the Pentagon and had one combat tour in Afghanistan before his retirement 10 years ago. Now let's start right away. Senate President Ron Kochi, you ended the session with an apology to the public. Why was that necessary? What had happened? And have you ever experienced anything quite like that?
No, I haven't experienced anything like that. But most of my tenure was at the county council, where you just come back 2 weeks later and you keep on going. It's not you put down the gavel and you're not expected back for another year. And it was certainly an issue that every single member of the legislature put a lot of effort into. The public sent so much testimony to us, and to wind up where we couldn't find that middle path was certainly, to me, very disappointing. But the question asked to me is, after all that time and you didn't come up with a result, what do you say? Well, the first thing you do is apologize and take responsibility for what you weren't able to accomplish, and let them know that we're still ready to go back to the table. We'd still like to work on the issue, and hopefully we'll be able to find that middle path and get a better result.
Speaker Scott Saiki, you were standing next to Senator Kochi when he said that. Were you feeling the same kind of sentiment, and what was, in your opinion, had gone wrong? We're talking about the rail issue primarily, but there was a lot of other disappointments in this session. Well,
I have to say that the rail issue is probably the most problematic issue that I've dealt with in all of my years at the legislature. And the main concern that I have about rail is that it has basically divided our state. I mean, it's divided the legislature, it's divided unions and the legislature, state versus county, county versus county, windward residents versus leeward and central residents. And it's very unfortunate that that has happened. And I'm very hopeful that the legislature will find a middle ground, as the president just mentioned. I can speak for the House. The House members believe that there needs to be some action taken on this issue so that we can fix it and move on.
Chad Blair, I mean, in your opinion, from the journalist's point of view, what did you see go wrong on that particular issue that took the rail off the tracks?
Bills can change a lot, Daryl. You know this from covering the legislature, but boy, the iterations of SB 1183, when Lorraine Inouye first introduced it, when the House got a hold of it, it changed so dramatically. At one point, Jill Takuda, the WAM chair, was just going to return the skim. That was going to be it. A House committee actually approved an idea to extend, if not into perpetuity, to 2047. And then there was ideas of funding education and so forth. So dramatic, the variations of that bill. And then for it to come down.
At the very last minute.
By the very last minute, it essentially boiled down to TAT, the hotel tax from the House, with some extension of the GET, the general excise tax, and the Senate's position to favor the general excise tax. I thought there would be compromise. I kept on asking leaders, why can't you come to agreement? And I was surprised at the standoff, particularly that last Friday of conference committee, where it looked like there was agreement on the House vehicle.
Wayne Yoshioka, what did you see that struck you about this, the difference between this and other issues in the past, for example?
I think the contentious issue of using the GET versus the TAT was something that there was no middle ground. The GET is one segment of the population that comes from, and the TAT comes from an industry. So to find middle ground at that time, with 96 days already gone, with 6 days left before the end of the session, there was no middle ground to be had. If they went into conference committee a little earlier, possibly with both solutions, possibly there could have been some kind of concession or agreement, but at that stage it was just not possible.
Senate President Kochi, I imagine this was quite particularly painful because everybody wanted to pass something, as opposed to times when, something's being held hostage for something else. I know my question to everybody was, where's the big deal going to come from? Where's the big trade-off? But you ended up with sort of, I don't know if it's proper to call this, sort of a mini revolt on your hands. What was going through your mind when that was happening? I imagine you knew what was going to happen when they took the votes to extend the excise tax on the Senate floor. Did you know what was going to happen, or were you surprised by what happened in front of you?
Well, I think once it was announced that Senator Kahele was introducing a floor amendment, then it became clear that he had the votes, or he wouldn't be coming forward with an amendment.
He hasn't been around very long. To be able to pull off a sophisticated move like that was pretty interesting.
Well, when you looked at how the votes came out, it seemed like, he just tapped into where a majority of the Senate was at. I think, when we did agree on Friday to the version that came over from the House to consider TAT, the only way for our full caucus to get a discussion on it was to keep the bill alive, which was agreeing and not walking away from the table. If we simply said no to the TAT as a solution on the last day of conference, then rail would have been dead at that point. By agreeing, it allowed us to get the bill to the full caucus. It did allow for the weekend for the visitor industry, the trades, and the general public, all who were greatly affected by the draft, to at least get some comments to legislators. And in the end, as the Senate looked at it, again, a majority felt that they wanted to stick with the surcharge. I certainly explained that you understand. I believe the House is strongly in favor of their position, so this may wind up with no bill. And, they still express how strongly they feel.
So you saw the block at the end of the rail there. Speaker.
So, what the House position makes clear is what we believe is the crux of the problem with rail, and that is the fact that the city and Hart are running out of money in August. And the projected shortfall at that point will be $1.3 billion for the segment from Middle Street to Ala Moana Center, and another $350 million for the Pearl City Highland rail park and ride facility. That shortfall was addressed in our House bill, because what we're attempting to do is to provide more funds to the city through the TAT between now and the year 2024. And the reason why that's important is because...
Let me stop you just long enough to explain to the public what we're talking about. Your proposal was essentially to increase the TAT and put it immediately to rail, starting, I think, next year.
Right.
And that way the money's in the bank sooner, so they don't perhaps have to borrow as much in a few years, as opposed to the mayor's proposal, which was to extend it out and not get that additional money for 10 more years.
Right. The House proposal would have provided $1.7 billion to the city between now and the year 2028. And that's important because that's where the shortfall is. The shortfall is between now and the year 2024. The city needs to find funds to make up that shortfall.
Journalists, toss in here, where do you see the failure?
Well, before the journalists come in, I certainly missed a big point of the purpose of the amendment. As far as an extension of...
Talking about Kahele's amendment.
Yes. As far as the extension of the surcharge, that had been in previous drafts of the bill. It had been heard. Another issue of importance for the Senate is we believe that the House language would have passed a straight legal test to have been inserted at the late date. But the concern was, should we have a tax increase without having better public process and input? And while we used a similar process to acquire Turtle Bay, there wasn't a huge outcry that that's a bad thing. It certainly wasn't a tax increase, but in this case, now if we go back into a special session, if those are some of the ideas put forward by the House, it will allow the proper hearings to be held and the public process to occur. And that was certainly an important part of the argument put forward with the amendment.
And the other thing you were doing is you were, in a sense, taking on, allowing the county to do what it wanted to do. That was the mayor's request. That was another part of the support behind that thing. Where do you see, but I mean, I don't want to get too much into all the weeds of these different proposals, because ultimately you guys are going to have to come out and figure something out. So what's the process?
And I think the governor was right in that he said we have to look at all state resources. We have to look at the TAT. We have to look at the GET. But what happened in the Turtle Bay situation when they bought 65 acres or whatever that was, they didn't increase the TAT, and you had Senator Kai Kahele, on the floor saying 1 percentage point increase in the TAT is $4 million of lost revenue to the city and for the county of Hawaii. So when you get that position, it's really hard to find middle
Darrell, the
ground.
governor also said he was glad that the TAT hike was scaled back. Was it 2.75 back down to 1%, because he worried about the impact on the tourism industry. There was also the plan to have private money come in, something that the mayor has talked about. We really haven't seen that. It's only been the federal money and the GET, and I wonder if there might be some more discussion about private money. The mayor has talked about the landowners along the last part of the route.
Let me read two questions really quickly, and one is just bust the rail down already. That was a caller from Hilo. The legislative session was a disaster because there was too much focus on rail, which the state does not have the money to finish building. Did rail get in the way of the ability to finish off other issues?
I think rail did take up a lot of time. It did monopolize a lot of legislators' time. I mean, it's a big issue. It's complex. There's no clear answer to rail. It did take a lot of time.
So the two leaders, what do you think is going to happen now? Is this something that the two houses of the legislature can do by themselves, or do you need other parties involved more actively, more constructively than you have right now?
Well, I think that the speaker and I have the ability to sit down and talk. And then I think that having the conversation would identify what we think would be a pathway to achieve success. And so at this point, who that may entail and what that may entail, I don't know what it is. The one thing the speaker and I agree on, and we had a chance to talk at a Hokkaido sister state relationship, is that we're going to sit and talk, and we're both open to having the conversation, and neither side has said, I don't believe this can be worked out.
But you have good information. I mean, one of the complaints that we heard was that the people were not comfortable with what they're hearing from the city. Do you feel like you have the tools you need to work this out, to the dollars and cents? Or
Well, all that we really need from the city is an accurate cost estimate of the cost of rail. And that's been one of the frustrations we've had this entire session, is that those numbers always change. They change throughout the session. I'm assuming that the most current estimate of $8.165 billion is accurate. So we're going to have to base our assumptions on that number. Yeah, and it's just a matter of, at this point, figuring out what is the shortfall and how do you pay for it.
You know, it's easy to armchair quarterback this thing, but if maybe
That's
the
what we
Senate,
do.
if maybe the Senate or the House at the beginning of the session said, you know, we're getting all these different numbers from the city and from the Honolulu Authority for Rapid Transportation. Let's stand up a special investigative committee and let's look at it. Let's get the real numbers and go from there, instead of having the WAM and Finance chair get into the weeds with cost overruns, alternate route modes, and all that stuff.
Contingency funds.
It was just so cumbersome that they didn't have to conduct 9-hour hearings on rail.
Well, and finally, let me just throw this out as a last point. That caller who mentioned, the focus on rail, sometimes legislature has trouble. Someone said dealing with more than one shiny object at a time. It was a little demeaning comment, but I've heard that one. But in the end, there tends to be a lot of brinkmanship, and that's systemic. As a new speaker, and yourself, Senator, with new leadership on the money side at least. Do you see that changing? I mean, isn't that something we need to change in order to be successful with an issue like this?
Well, I believe that we'll find that path. Part of the problem is that if you look at the column inches or the amount of minutes on the television news that was allocated to rail, we all got sucked into the vortex. And so many good bills that passed that I talked about on the closing day of session were never reported in any of the articles or in the television newscasts, and it was all about rail and the failure to come to the agreement, and never talked about the great things we did in education, the strides we made in homelessness, getting even something that seems so small, but it's an ombudsman for the elderly affairs, because there's one person on Oahu trying to deal with all of these complaints. As our population continues to live longer and age, there's no one to help deal with the complaints and get them through the system. And we put another person in so the neighbor islands can get service and acknowledgement of the help that we need for our elderly or kupuna community. But none of those ever made the press.
That's a great segue to start moving on to some other issues in case we get more calls about rail, which is possible. The first question I got a couple of questions about another very big issue. What can we do to have the legislature pass the medical aid in dying bill? That was another one where there seemed to be, the stars seemed aligned, and it just stopped at some point. I think it was the House that killed it. So yes. Speaker Saiki, what went wrong with that? I think, is there general consensus that a majority of the population wants that bill?
Well, the polling shows that there's general support for the concept of medical aid in dying. I don't think that anything went wrong with the process on the House side. The bill was deferred in the House Health Committee, but I have to say that when you look at what happened in that committee, that is an example of democracy in action. I mean, for those who are very interested in making sure that we follow a democratic process, that is exactly what happened in the Health Committee. Because going into that hearing, the majority of the members on that committee supported the proposal. But after hearing testimony for 3 hours, and a lot of it from doctors who have concerns about this, they changed their position and they decided to defer that bill. So that to me is an example of House members, committee members, listening to the public, listening to the concerns, and then basing their decision on that input.
But I would just add here, I respect what the speaker is saying, and there was a change in the vote. It looked like Speaker Suki, actually, this is something he pushed very strongly. John Radcliffe, the beloved lobbyist who's ill, the numbers changed, but what we did not see is we did not see an actual vote. We didn't see how the Health Committee voted. We didn't see how the Judiciary would have voted. We didn't see how all 51 members, we did see that on the Senate. We saw a 22-3 vote, including a very emotional testimony from Senator Breen Harimoto. And that's frustrating for a lot of people, that there was a sense that we didn't see where people stood on this position. And that's something that was a great concern. I would just add, Senator, we did in fact report some of the good news that came out. Your point is well taken. You passed the media access bill. Thank you very much for that. I have a few other quims, but I'll stop there.
But you know, Darrell, I think the state constitution has made this such a way that they introduced 2,918 bills, 1,300 from the Senate, 1,600 from the House, and they passed 230. Over a 60-day period, legislative period, over 4 months, you have got to time manage everything. You can't spend 9 hours on one bill and expect to pass anything. They usually pass about 300 bills per session. 70 short this session.
Let me give Speaker Psyche a chance to respond to that question about, well, you may say this is democracy, but nobody's voting. The same thing happened with the rail vote at the end. You know, there were complaints that, you know, there were no way to count votes. And I know Speaker Suki often talked about protect the member, that being a major role of leadership. Is that what was happening here? Were people being protected from people, a backlash for holding them accountable for their votes? So why would there not be a public vote on those issues?
No, well, with the Health Committee vote on the Death with Dignity bill, deferring the bill means that you're just pushing it to the next legislative session. So you're not killing the bill, basically. You're just deferring it for future action and consideration.
But you don't have to vote on a deferral. That's pretty much the chair.
You don't vote on a deferral. But what happened in that hearing, which was also kind of unusual, was that each member made public comments on the recommendation to defer the bill. And that does not happen very often. And the members gave very personal reasons for why they supported the deferral. And I support their decision. I don't begrudge them for that decision. I think that they, after listening to the testimony, they made the call for themselves. And that's what people are voted for. They have to just make those kinds of decisions.
And I'd remind you in parliamentary procedure, what the chair says, if there are no objections, the chair recommends that this bill be deferred. So if you have a different opinion from the chair, you have an opportunity to register an objection. The silence indicates that all members voted in agreement with the chair. So I would argue, like the speaker, that in the Health Committee a vote was taken and there were no objections to the recommendation. And then, of course, as he pointed out, they did the unusual move or, by speaking at length in deferrals. Normally a deferral is not debated.
So now let's start getting through some more just substantive. There's a long list of things that happened or didn't happen. I mean, you mentioned the long-term care ombudsman. We did do a show about Kapuna Care, which was a highly protected program under the retired Senator Susie Chan Oakland. How did that go? Did that pass this year? Was there an
Well, Kapuna Care got their funding. The question is, they had programs that they'd like to see expanded. And I think the story that or at least I opened the legislative session with in my opening remarks and also got completely lost in the rail story, is we started on June 30th of last year with $1 billion surplus for one day. July 1st, under the law, we paid the $500 million to the unfunded liability. That's the first bill we paid.
For the pensions.
So the $1 billion surplus was immediately cut in half. Other obligations happened. And then we had downgrades from the Council of Revenues. We had a lowering of the assumption of the interest rate of return by the ERS. The actuarial showed longer life expectancies.
Did you notice it magically right after the session ended, that jumped up back again?
And then the March report was lower again. And so part of having 70 less bills is that we started with all these bills and these lofty ambitions and hopes and dreams about all the new programs we'd be able to expand and do, and then the money ran out.
You also had to pay for public sector unions, 14 of them, their bargaining units, all of those contracts up. You had to put a lot of money aside from that. The governor's saying they're going to have to find the money in the budget somehow.
So the teachers got a 13.6% raise, $116 million off the top. 10 more unions settle at 3 or 7%. For each percentage point, that's $104 million. So we're talking $800 million right off the bat, cut off, just like when the Council of Revenues lowered their expectations, $800 million. That must be a magic number.
Is that the great wet blanket of this session?
Yeah, and what's happening over time is that less and less of the state budget is discretionary. I mean, more and more of it is just fixed costs that we have to fund every year. So that that makes it challenging for the legislature.
I wrote this down and I haven't gotten a question on it because I don't think there was, again, much coverage of this. There was some coverage. There was a significant number of tax measures that passed this year. Most of them struck me as being ways of getting more money into the state treasury as opposed to getting money in anybody else's treasury. Income tax rates for the higher incomes were raised. There was reform. Speaker Psyche, could you describe for me what was the tax bills, the significant things that are going to affect people going ahead? And, Senate President Kochi, please pitch in. If what do you think is the tax bills that were significant and what were their impacts?
So I think that the most significant tax bill that we passed this year was the Earned Income Tax Credit Bill. And that is a bill that has been around for probably over 20 years at the legislature. And it basically provides a tax credit for working families and working individuals. And that's something that, as I said, it took 20 years to pass, but it was funded by the increase in maintaining the income tax level for the higher bracket. So that's where the trade-off was.
The increasing. Is increasing, right? And so, Senator, though, wasn't there a compromise made on that bill? I mean, that ultimately the net is still going to increase to the state as opposed to the individual taxpayers?
Yes.
That is, more is going to the state than is going to the taxpayers.
Yes, as the budget continued to shrink and other programs, needed to get funding, that decision was made. But also part of the Earned Income Tax Credit is there was certainly a strong feeling in our caucus that if we're going to extend the rail surcharge, and we do have it today, there is great concern about the regressive nature of the general excise tax and its impact on our lowest income population. And therefore, if this was going to occur, then it was important to acknowledge the regressive nature and get some help to those in the lowest income brackets.
The other tax measures that didn't fare too well were the highway taxes that they wanted. Was there anything done for the highway system out of this session? No, just they'll have to live with what they got.
Yes.
And spend it faster.
Isn't
that a big issue for them?
They've been doing a great job in moving the projects through the pipeline and catching up and being in compliance with the federal government. But, the public was pretty clear on not wanting to see an increase in the fuel tax, in the weight tax, or the vehicle registration fees.
But now I guess the county mayors are saying that they need more revenue, they need more money, and isn't that what the county surcharge would do, the transportation, the 0.5% of the GET? They can opt to use that if they pass legislation.
If we agree on a rail bill, that would be an option to them. But again, I think we're specifically talking about just the fuel tax, the vehicle registration fee, and the weight tax.
But it's interesting, though, I mean, in our discussion, it's clear there were dominoes. Here's the rail bill, and then there was a series of dominoes after that. When you pull out the rail bill, the dominoes stop, and they don't knock down any more dominoes, right? That's kind of what we had happen. A couple more things really quickly. We did transportation. You guys want to throw anything out?
I want to throw something out.
Go ahead.
You talk about not having as much money as in previous years. A bill that died in conference committee on the very last day, in the very last hour, it had died the previous two sessions at exactly the same time, was voting by mail, something that we were going to implement by 2020.
That died?
All counties. It died.
Man.
I was sitting right there when your Senator, Gil Keith Ageron, the lead conferee, and your Senator, Scott Nishimoto, handling the judiciary, Gil Keith Ageron was pushing for an answer. We're ready to commit. And Nishimoto had to say, we don't have concurrence. We don't have a sign-off from leadership. At times like that, for a bill that actually would save money, it would actually reduce the expense of running elections. And you know what? Get more people to turn out to vote. The bill itself acknowledged we are dead last in the nation. How on earth did that bill die? And how come leadership didn't come out and say, we just didn't like it, we don't want more people voting, or just tell us the truth? That's a big frustration that a lot of people have.
A lot of bills died. I used to cover water fluoridation way back when Senate President Kochi was still 10 years old or something. I mean, we covered all those heptachlor in the milk, all those bills, and they all died. We're still covering water fluoridation. We're still doing, trying to give clinical psychologists prescription authority for mentally
Let me go
ill
back really
patients.
quickly to find out from the leaders what happened with
Thanks,
that
Darryl.
bill.
So a couple of things. One is that the bills that didn't make it this year carry over to next year's session. So they're still alive for next year and can be considered next year. And the second point is that, I'm very optimistic that that bill will be approved next year.
Why does it take 4 years instead of 3 or 2 or 1 for some bills to make it? One that seems to be a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think the issue there was that there were some logistical concerns by the counties that have to put this implement that requirement.
My
I know
understanding is that the county clerk for Oahu, for the neighbor islands, the state clerk, county elections office, Scott Nago, they were all in support of it. They're the ones that are going to run the elections.
Okay, you had your chance.
Thanks,
Next
Darryl.
one. Okay. Caller is disappointed and frustrated to focus on rail when it will probably be obsolete. Well, we can talk about that later. But they should fund education, schools, social programs, service programs, and ways to address homelessness. We haven't talked about homelessness yet. Thank you for bringing that up, caller. What was the homeless package? Was it, again, also affected by the lack of money?
No. The attention that has been brought to the issue and what has been happening in our communities across this state, once again, the legislature exceeded the amount requested from the administration to fund the homeless programs. It was encouraging to see that the overall decrease of 9% and some impact is being made.
You're talking about the point in time count.
Yeah. And also, where I live on Kauai, I drive past Walmart. I'm not here to do a commercial for Walmart.
But you're going to say there's homeless people around it.
No.
So probably not gonna help them. No,
No,
sorry.
to get home, there's an open field between Walmart and Wilcox Hospital. When the owner of the vacant land finally cleared out that property, we found out there was an encampment of over 200 homeless people. Wow. And I had no idea, driving home every day past that vacant lot, that there were that many homeless people living there. And so this is a problem that's statewide, and we're committed to work on it. And there are many different strategies, and there's no one size fits all. The other thing that is going to be significant is we finally passed the bill that says when you are released from prison, you'll be given a real ID. It's been a real issue for people who have been discharged from prison to simply apply for a job and have the proper ID to go through and get the paperwork filled out. And if there's any time we should know who a person is, it's after we've brought them to court, tried and convicted them and incarcerated them. And so now when they get out, this will be a big help. I know in the documentary that ran, the one individual being interviewed, talked about just how difficult it was for him to try to make a go after he got released simply by not having the proper or valid ID.
Speaker Saki, what do you think will be impactful on homelessness from your perspective?
So this year we appropriated funds for the Housing First program. Also, we appropriated funds for mental health and substance abuse treatment for homeless individuals, and also extra social work positions. We also appropriated funds, $25 million for the Rental Housing Trust Fund, $25 million for the Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund, and those funds are used to subsidize the cost of affordable housing development.
I'm trying to remember what the governor's goal was, and the stated goal for how many affordable units they wanted to build over the next
20,000 in the
20,000.
next 10 years.
So did you guys do what you need to do to meet those goals?
So there's an agency called the Hawaii Housing Finance Development Corporation, HHFDC, which helps to plan and coordinate affordable developments in the state. And they have they actually have a chart where they have projects lined up each year or every 2 years. And they basically come in every year and request funding for each on a project-by-project basis. And that schematic shows, I think it's about 2,000 or 3,000 units over the next few years. So we're incrementally trying to fund these projects. It's a matter of resources. There's limited financial resources.
And then
But
we
the
have
legislature also put in their requirement to Leo Asuncion, who's the director of the Office of Planning. It's 22,500 affordable rental units by 2025. So the legislature has their requirements, the governor's got their requirements, and DBED's got this forecast of 65,000 units by 2030.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving through. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we got a lot to get through here. Two questions. Why don't we have a lottery? Any shot at that this year? Last year? I mean,
Wrong House Speaker.
It's it's introduced. In fact, it was introduced. You always have gambling bills. Lottery being the most popular now. I don't know why we keep trying. Aren't we one of only 2 states besides Utah that doesn't have some sort of form of legalized gambling? Having said that, the revenue potential, particularly for things like education, is very appealing. And one wonders whether, speaking of John Radcliffe, there might be time to pass a gambling bill.
charter funding for charter preschools, and I guess for charter schools. Was charter schools given anything this year?
Well, I think the issue they're trying to raise is when they adopted the charter schools bill, they said they wouldn't compete with the Department of Education for capital improvement money. And so there's very little capital improvement money that charter schools are able to get. And as they're maturing, or we have new schools that want to come online, there's been an increased lobbying effort to get better capital improvement funds for charter schools.
Okay, moving along too. I got a lot of questions here, and I really want to honor our viewers because they make the effort to call. Why did the legislature not support the committee recommendation to let the counties keep their share of the TAT? I'm not sure if that's quite what the different proposals were, but TAT in the end was reduced by 10 million because that's what was in the legislation from before. But briefly discuss the philosophy behind reducing the amount of money for the counties in the TAT.
Well, one of the
Hotel.
things I've expressed to the speaker, if we get back into special session, a part of the last draft that they put over on that Tuesday restored the 10 million back to the 103 that the counties got, and I indicated to him whether it's in the bill itself that we had or during the special session, we may be able to take up a limited amount of bills. And one bill I would consider is a bill that would restore the $10 million to the counties and bring them back to the 103 million they got the last few years.
Speaker.
Yeah, so that was an important part of our proposal in the rail bill. And you're right that the $10 million reduction had already been approved in a prior bill a few years ago.
Okay, this question came in early. It's taken me a while to get to it because I wanted to do environment toward the end, but we're almost at the end. What bills can the legislature pass to protect the ocean from styrofoam? I think they're talking about styrofoam. They're also talking about bags. What was the biggest things that you did for the environment, would you say, this year? You guys could also, if you guys know of anything, you could pitch into.
Well, there was this bill there's this chemical in sunscreen called oxybenzone. And
That's the question I just got right here.
So probably styrofoam, oxybenzone.
Yeah.
It kills coral reefs. It's quite dangerous. And there was a move to eliminate that chemical, to have sunscreens not use that. There were efforts to have that banned or prohibited. They came across some problems. I think we ended up with is there going to be a working group?
Yes.
There will be a study, and maybe it'll come up. It's a fairly new issue, and I was encouraged that they're at least moving in that direction. I thought that was good news. There also the greenhouse gas bill. Senator Jay Kalani English pushed for Hawaii, trying to limit its greenhouse gases along the lines of the Paris Agreement from 2 years ago. That's a pretty noble effort.
Well, not just noble, but with everything happening on the national level, if they do dismantle the EPA, it would ensure that we put those environmental protections in state statute to try to adhere by the Paris Accord.
Speaking of dismantling, there was something about Obamacare too. Didn't something pass in that regard to
Right, I want to
Oh, go ahead.
give one more example of an environmental bill because this is a stealth issue that one of my colleagues, Representative Jarrett Keokalole, has worked on over the past year, and that's the cesspool issue. So there are 90,000 cesspools in the state, basically not really regulated, that are aging and may at some point impact the water table. So Jarrett has worked on legislation this year, which we approved, to create a mandate for maintenance and replacement of these cesspools, and also provided funding for a tax credit to assist with the replacement.
Okay, another question. Why did the legislature not pass the bill for funding legal aid services that provide help for the poor and underserved? I think that Senator Chang made his closing day speech. He called that like one of the worst things that was done this year. What happened with that? That was a cutback in basically free lawyers for poor people.
Well, there's a couple of sources of funding for the nonprofit legal services. One is through the judiciary budget, and one is through a special fund that's generated by filing fees at court. And what happened was one of those components was not funded, but the other was. So it was a partial reduction, but it was also discretionary because the second appropriation was really discretionary, and it's something that the legislature had done over the past few years.
Discretionary meaning it's
not
nice if you can, but it's not essential
right.
because there's an existing program.
It's not a part of the budget.
Okay, speaking of lawyers, this ended up being quite a heavily covered issue. The lifeguard liability bill. Why was there no opportunity for public input when this bill was modified? I'm a little bit confused about that, but just what happened with that bill? Senator Coach?
Well, the Senate passed over
it,
a
right?
bill which would have extended the current bill for another 4 years.
And the issue there is that lifeguards, county lifeguards that cover state beaches, felt like they needed liability protection. Is that a fair way of saying that? But then it got flip-flopped back. There's a lot of machinations going on with that.
Well, they do have immunity. There's a sunset. It's going to expire June 30th. It keeps coming up year after year, and the county councils and the county mayors have said, look, you've just got to make this permanent, because otherwise we're going to incur the cost of potential legal problems. We may not even be able to put lifeguards on the beaches. We were talking about this earlier in the green room. There are some pro and con arguments. The bill was amended. If I remember correctly, the Senate did approve an extension, but the House said, let's have the Attorney General handle the lawsuits. And I think that's where it left off.
Right, so the Attorney General is now required to defend lifeguards who may be sued for negligence. But I think the larger issue is, and that is something that we need to work on for next year, but the larger issue is, why are we singling out one group of workers and providing them with immunity? There are other state and county workers who also provide these kinds of public services, like firefighters, first responders, who are not being afforded the same kind of level of protection.
But as Civil Beat has reported, drowning is the #1 reason why tourists die when they come here, and it's a very serious problem. We have some very dangerous waves in a lot of places. It seems like every week somebody's drowning in our waters, and the high-profile situation, I think, calls attention to what a lifeguard has to do.
People were making the assumption, I think the assertion was being made by lifeguards, that this will reduce their ability to protect people. Do you believe that?
No, I believe that lifeguards will do their best to protect the public regardless.
Okay, let me move on again. County hospital funding. Now I know Maui Hospital, that finally got taken care of, right?
Yes.
Okay, what about the other? I think this question is about other hospitals. This is a caller from Hilo. Is it Neighbor
They were
Island?
funded, and they'll be operating, and you haven't heard on any of the state hospitals that there are any projected layoffs.
One of our other callers also asked in the line of, rail getting in the way of things, how did you feel you did on school funding? Do you think that you made progress toward adequately funding schools, particularly facilities, things like air conditioning?
1/3 of the $1 billion capital budget is for school facilities improvements. And one of the bills that did pass was being able, or DOE being able to access GEMS funds on an interest-free loan to help achieve some of the cooling that we hope to get to.
GEMS funds is money that comes off of our electric bills that goes into this fund and has basically been sitting there unused, right? So
A green infrastructure loan program.
And public schools receive between 18 and 20% of the state budget. The state budget is $14.1 billion next year. So it's a pretty high percentage. It's larger than most other areas.
But I think Senate President Kochi said that this year, for the first time, we have Department of Human Services budget being larger than
Last year.
Happened last year.
All
didn't it?
sources
Yeah.
all sources of funds when you count federal funds and other mechanisms. But in public education, there is both early education, or not early education, early or running start.
primary
No, running start, and the ability to running start is you get public school students who are able to enroll at community college or the University of Hawaii, and then you have the program where they bring the instructors to the high schools. And in my district, they've seen, when I've talked to the principals at Kapa'a and Waimea High School, and principals out on the Leeward Coast here on Oahu, first in the family going to college. And they've had tremendous success in driving up the numbers as far as the percentage of graduating high school seniors who are choosing to go to college. And so this is really creating that ladder of opportunity for our young people.
And I think Waimea High School has a 99% graduation rate.
And speaking of graduation, Representative Justin Woodson from Maui worked really hard to include in the state budget funding for a new program at the University of Hawaii that will provide a tuition relief for community college students. And that should impact about 1,000 low-income students.
did you make progress on the UH backlog of facilities? Facilities maintenance? I know that's often an issue with them, that they're sort of crumbling.
I seem to recall that there's about 85 million specifically for Manoa. Then they have money put in for the community colleges, and then we regularly put in a $10 million minor CIP budget for the community colleges in anticipation of the repairs that will come up in the course of the year.
I've got a call from a lawyer who organized this settlement. Why'd the House refuse to fund the federal court settlement for long-suffering foster parents? It was supported by the Senate, the governor, the AG, and DHs, yet the House killed it. Why?
The concern in the House was that the request for attorney's fees was too large.
So you were kind not to say who the attorney was.
Speaker's an attorney, of course.
See, this is the problem if you call into the show, the guys on the show get the last word. So, okay, we got a bunch more questions about rail that are actually kind of very interesting. And let me just throw this stuff out because I want to get through all these questions. As a neighbor island resident, why should we be required to pay for rail that we won't use, especially when Hart is a mess and doesn't know the final price tag? This is a widely held misconception.
Correct.
I think, right? That there is no intention in the legislature. In fact, I think one of the problems that the Senate had with the House's first bill was there was some tourist tax money that was going to be collected in the neighbor islands and then go to rail, and they didn't want that to happen, right? So is that a red line? You don't want neighbor islands to be paying for the rail?
Well, I mean, that's an issue that the President and I will have to discuss when the rail bill comes back up. But it was a matter of, the House's proposal was really just a matter of equity because, there were several neighbor island legislators who were very vocal advocates of the rail system. And so we felt that the cost should be shared between all the islands.
Last I checked, I was a neighbor island legislator.
Okay, I think I heard a red line in the sand.
No, but Daryl, what's interesting, I guess, is that we have been taking $30 million a year. Call it the skim, call it the 10% fee. But that goes to the general fund. And myself, as a neighbor island legislator, get to appropriate that $30 million throughout the state. So as this has been operating today, the neighbor islands have enjoyed some of the surcharge that's been generated and paid by the people here on Oahu. And certainly as we fund our hospitals and our education system, arguably that money is coming out to the neighbor islands, although we haven't contributed to it. So, it's not, going to be the first time that one area of the state has subsidized another because of the amount of centralized systems we have, unlike the rest of the country.
So, House Speaker, we're back to Senate Draft 1. So we need to work forward.
Yeah, well, let's not, the weeds. So, I think that there have been a couple of questions because we were kind of discouraging on the legislative process early in the show, and it prompted a number of questions. Does the U.S. two-party system work for the island state in the middle of the Pacific is one. Another one is, given the range of serious budgetary and policy issues, isn't it time for a professional, full-time legislature? And another question about why do you let committee chairs kill things? So, I mean, are there, you've got some new leadership in your body. You've got clearly new leadership. Are you guys going to change this system in the legislature?
Well, I'd like to actually address, isn't it time for a full-time legislature in that question? Whether you're a county council member who was termed part-time or a legislator, this has changed everything in the way that we do business, and it's changed everything in the public's expectation of what their elected officials need to do. So you're emailed, you're called, you get Twitter, and constant communication. And my schedule since we've adjourned has been booked. And then when I get back to Kauai, because I'm not there all the time, then I'm booked because you've got to see this. We want to talk to you about this particular project. And so as soon as I walk off the plane, I'm going to the next meeting and the next meeting, and all of us are diligently trying to do our job the best way we can. And so we may meet for 60 legislative days, but we go to work every day, including the weekends, because you can find all of us.
Well, Speaker Saiki, you're a full-time attorney when you're not in the legislature. I mean, is it really, going back to this person's question, when we see what happened this time ran out. Is time running out a good thing? Does that actually make legislators act when they might not act? If you had a full-time legislature, would it be full-time stalling, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the legislature should be part-time because I think you want people to have you want a membership that has different kinds of experiences and who are doing things outside of the legislature while they're serving. So I think being part-time is a good thing. As far as the process goes, because there was a question about the committee chairs.
Right, how you make your decision.
Yeah, the legislature, because of the time schedule, and I believe that people are generally deadline driven, right? Everyone is, for the most part, is deadline driven at some point. The legislature rests upon the committee system because is the committees that sift through bills. As Wayne mentioned, there were 3,000 bills introduced this past year. You have to have a mechanism to sift through the bills, to prioritize them, to hear them, and to move them if they are worthy of being moved, if they're merit-based. And the chair has to take responsibility for that.
And Chad Blair, this is an opportunity. You've got the House Senate President on one side and House Speaker on the other. What did you see? If you could make one change in the way they operated, what would you change?
Please don't have the legislature full-time throughout the year. I just couldn't handle that. I think the public is really confused about conference committee. It's a very challenging time.
The negotiating at the end.
Yeah, it's done behind closed doors. Something very unusual happened. Again, it's the rail bill, where
We've only got about 15 or 20 seconds.
Sylvia Luke and Lorraine Inouye actually argued back and forth on the merits of their various proposals. I thought that was terrific. It was pretty brutal, pretty intense, but it really showed how difficult the discussions are. I'd like to see more transparency.
Wayne?
I think the legislature needs to do a better job to let the public know that they can't backdate legislation and fix something that's broken before. And it's on forward-looking, and they can't backdate or change anything in the past. They need to communicate that with the public.
Last thing, we have about a minute left. we did promise the public that we would try and do some grading here. So let me start with Chad Blair. If you had to grade the overall, the whole session.
I think the Senate President has a good point. A lot of good bills did come out of the session, and because of the dominance of the rail tax, we didn't hear a whole lot of that, and I would want to have that happen.
Okay,
I'd say...
grade. 10 seconds.
Okay, a C-.
Grade.
I gave them an incomplete because they ran out of time. They didn't win, they just ran out of time.
Senate President.
Well, I said incomplete because we did not reach an agreement over rail, and
Not
it
a
wasn't
huge
about
issue.
time. It was about finding the place.
And I say that the Oscar for Best Picture goes to the legislature.
I didn't see that picture. Boy, you're learning to punt quick. So you don't want to, well, okay, well, come on, really quickly.
No, I think the legislature did a great job. I think there are a lot of very complex issues this year.
And B, I got to go to prompter. I got to thank everybody for joining us, all of our viewers, and we thank our guests as well. Senate President Ron Kochi, Chad Blair with Civil Beat, Speaker of the House Scott Saiki, and Wayne Yoshioka with Hawaii Public Radio. Next week on Insights, join the discussion on speaking truth to power. We hear that phrase used a lot lately, but what does it really mean? Meet people who changed Hawaii, and in some cases the country, because they took a courageous stand against powerful people and institutions. I'm Daryl Huff for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Ahui ho.